Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. Fiona and Marlene here again, and this week we've been out and about at a very good event which we're going to share with you.
I got an email from Mary McCabe, who is an author. Just an email saying there's an event happening in Hillhead Library, anyone wants to go? And I went, oh, I'll go. And then realised it was Mary and several other authors, and we thought perhaps we could record it. So this podcast has come out of that email and a very helpful publishing company, Ringwood Publishing Company, who put the event on. All the authors are published via Ringwood.
A thoroughly enjoyable event it was as well. I mean, listening to Scottish authors talking about their own experiences, some from a long time ago, some more recent. It's a little bit different from the kind of stuff we normally do. It wasn't particularly independence focused. Certainly there were themes that arose, but generally it was just Scottish culture, Scottish experience, Scottish writers. Hope you enjoy it. And the first author we hear from is Mary McCabe.
We're talking about memoirs. Two clauses in a referendum is quite clear, really. It's the year of 2014 and all the political happenings there, set against the residents of two fictional clauses. Memoirs, either mine or I do bring in the memoirs of people in the Better Together side as well, to an extent. So memoirs of activism, the actual political events as they happen on the media or in fact and so on. Anything political is fact and memoir. The actual characters and the backstories are all fiction, and the two sort of play against each other. Mm-hmm. The Stirring the Dust, it's different. It's also memoirs. Again, not fully my memoirs. Well, not a lot of them aren't my memoirs. It's 13 interlinked stories taken from colourful characters in my family tree on both sides. My mother's side was the wee towns along the Murray Firth in Banshire, and my father's side was West Central Scotland, industrial Glasgow and the bits around it. And the memoirs, it's people who've done something shocking, so it's not just great-grandfathers and things. The memoirs go from 1830 to the 1960s, so, you know, they're clearly not all my memoirs. But I tried to stick to the facts. I've tried to be as factual as possible with them all. So all the characters in it are real, they all existed. All the main events happened, and my sources for it, initially it was old stories from the old aunties about shocking things people did back then, and you know, particularly in Buckie, small town, you know, twitching your lace curtain is kind of, you know, there's always shocking things happening if you've got the right frame of mind. So old aunties' stories, genealogical research and documentation. And there were moments of serendipity. When I was doing my research, I came across an 1888 issue of the local Buckie paper, and amazingly, it happened to have an advert in it for my great-grandfather's sister, who was selling her house to emigrate to California, and she sold it for £660, so clearly she was the rich side of the family in those days. There were also all these wee shops giving their adverts. They were selling things like teeth. You could buy a tooth for 12.5 pence, half a crown. I don't know how they put it in, but you know, you could own the tooth if you had no teeth, you know, you could, and buy them like that. And they were also selling WCs, flushing ones. You pulled a chain and they happened, and they were advertising that plumbers were selling in. So things like that all added it, colour and atmosphere. And the personalities, I had to attribute personalities to everybody. Some of the personalities were not very nice. I always based it on something I'd heard about them. So I didn't just make up a horrible personality out of my head. To take an example, there was my great-grandfather's sister, Bella, who left her husband, abandoned her husband and 4 of her 5 children to run off with a street musician. So what kind of person was she? I would assume she didn't have a very happy marriage. There were stories about her. One was when they visited them, her husband got on to her for sitting down, and she said, I finished all my housework. And he said, we'll get up and walk about then. I can't fall to see idle, you swear bosom. And so they get up and walk about. So that tells you something about their relationship. On the other hand, They also said that she read Penny Dreadfuls all day, let the house fall about her ears. And also there was an incident where her children hitched a lift on a cart or something from their home in Cullen to my great-grandfather's home in Buckie, and said they couldn't find their mother and they were hungry, and he had to bring them in and give them all their dinner. So I based her on that. Once you were into my bit, which is towards the end, of course, I can bring a bit more atmosphere in. And to give an example, I changed schools when I was 8. The first school I was in was the school my mother was teaching in. She put me in there for handiness. It was a state primary in a poor area. When I was 8, she moved me to another school, which was not exactly private. The fees were like £3 a year. There were nominal fees. You did have to pay for the books, and you had to pay for the strict and uniform and stuff like that. They were attached to the teacher training college, and they did experimental educational methods. And I remember going from the other school to that school, it was like moving from black and white into Technicolor. The school I'd been in before had never left the 19th century. The classrooms were drab, the toilets were so primitive, and even the children had a kind of prudish attitude. If they were running about playing fever or something athletic, we were terrified somebody would see their knickers and things like that. I'll read to you what it was like. One August day, Mary stands in front of 40 strangers in a brown uniform and Panama hat, clutching a bag of books bought second-hand out of the ABC Educational Company. She's bid goodbye to the Sousa Band and the Janny's gramophone as they march down the stairwell. Scratcher pens, inkwells, and florid loopy handwriting. Rows of open-fronted desks all facing the teacher. The cracked wall map with half the world in pink. Peely-wally, shilpit manky 8-year-olds and sannies or wellies who play ring games in Peaver, who shout when the bell rings, the bell, the B-E-L, tell the teacher I'm no well. And who go, oh, if they glimpse one another's knickers. She bids good morning to desks set in a semicircle surrounding a nature table, fountain pens and plain joined script, personal desks which shut and can be used to keep books, jotters and mouldy play pieces. Walls garnished in splashy pictures and coloured friezes. Piercing white 8-year-olds who read as fluently as they speak, who hold brains trusts in the classroom, who go to Sunday school, who pull their gym slips over their heads and go to drill class in brown regulation knickers, and to tell her the dismal truth about Santa Claus. And Glen Ross, she was one of a minority living in a house with a bathroom. A tad more, she's possibly unique, living with a lone parent in a tenement in a distant council scheme with no phone, no TV, no fridge and no car. Wonderful.
The next speaker is author Carol Fox.
First of all, many thanks for you coming, and many thanks to everyone at Ringwood for inviting me to be part of this event. My book was published almost 10 years ago on International Women's Day in March 2015. My life then took a strange turn in 2015, so I haven't done a lot of these speaking events since then, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here. My book was written primarily for my daughter. I was keeping a record of what I was going through. For me initially, if I didn't manage to have a child, and for any child that I did manage to have, and then my book was dedicated to my daughter. But it was also for women facing infertility difficulties and reproductive choices, but also for a younger generation, I hope, to understand that things change because of the struggle, the courage and the bravery of previous generations. And I would say to you, a bit controversially, that the choices we have now were not delivered by any politician. They were delivered by ordinary women who faced adversity and took on the system and changed things from the bottom up. And I like to think that I made my contribution to that, particularly in terms of accepting and being more progressive in terms of modern families. What happened for me was I was faced with a very stark choice at quite a young age. When I was 20, I went into hospital and had a serious operation. And then when I was 27, it happened again, and I was told I wouldn't be able to have children at all. where I might have expected some compassion and some empathy from the medical profession. Just let's say, read my book, because that's not how it turned out. What I did get was a very patriarchal and judgmental attitudes, and there's a letter which I've put in the book, and in case Sandy or anyone else was sued, I did kind of typex out the name of the doctor, but the paragraph does write, I urge you to reconsider your decision to have a child out of wedlock. Now this was written to me in the late 1980s, not in the 1880s, so it shows you just how attitudes were then. And I'm speaking to a Glasgow audience in a yes city, but I have to say that we shouldn't pat ourselves in the back all the time about how good things are in Scotland, because actually we need to look at how bad some things are. And at that time, I had to leave Scotland and go to London to access any fertility treatment. My ambition was not to set off on some reproductive campaign or journey. My ambition was to have a baby if I could. That ambition led me to be on the front page of the Daily Record because it seemed to be a wee bit controversial. But I was faced with the stark choice that either I tried and maybe it didn't work, but I wanted that to be my choice. I didn't want that to be anybody else's choice. So the memoir particularly challenges the medical establishment. I think we should respect doctors. We should respect the knowledge and all the hard work they do. They should be able to explain how your heart works, or perhaps draw you a picture of your tonsils. They shouldn't tell you whether you can or can't have a child. I think the limit of the power that people in the elites and the establishment exercise over ordinary people, and particularly over women's lives, still needs to be challenged. So as I say, I had to leave Scotland, and I found more progressive attitudes in London. From my feminist perspective, in terms of memoirs, women's stories do deserve to be told, and not enough women's stories are told. And I think it's the power of memoirs and the power of what actually happens to people, the adversity that we overcome, and the resilience of the human spirit to overcome so much. I've recently moved house, and Maxine's visited me, and I have a very nice room, study, stroke library, which is now full of very many memoirs. And I find that they educate you into other societies and other experiences that you don't have. But also I find most of them very, very uplifting, because you can read what someone's going through and realise that you too can overcome these difficulties. I'm proud to claim my part in the feminist movement, and I'm proud of the work that I did in terms of equal pay and for other women. 10 years ago I stepped out of all that to look after my mum, because I wouldn't have managed to become a mother without her help. She was a nurse. She got dressed up in her finery with me. We went to Monklands Hospital together. She took on the consultants for me. She was at my back and delighted when she became a nana, and I wouldn't have survived as a single parent without her help. So when it came to when she had dementia, I gave up work to help her. So that's what I've been doing the last 10 years. So my book tells my journey of towards single parenthood. I'm absolutely delighted to have one daughter, the baby on the front cover, who's going to be 33 this year. So the years and the decades pass so, so quickly. I'm overjoyed too that she has her own baby and a little boy who's now 18 months. So I'm a grandmother, and I'm overjoyed to be a nana. And had I listened to the medical advice, and it wasn't medical advice I was getting, it was very Catholic advice, because the doctor, it turned out, was a Catholic father of 8, and that's why he wrote me that letter about not having a child outside wedlock. I've taken to be a bit like my mother, and I've been checking out the obituaries. So if I'm writing again, I've got to be careful, because apparently it's still around, and you've got to wonder how many women's lives he influenced. And that was adverse choices that they had to make because he wouldn't give them access to help that they needed. I wanted to exercise agency over my own body and over my own life, and to make those choices. And having done so, and since my book was kindly published by Ringwood 10 years ago, there were various other comments made about the choices. And everyone can have their own view on that. I'm absolutely fine and relaxed about that. What people can't do is decide what you're able to do. And I brought my daughter up to be very clear and positive that she was very wanted and very loved, and that other people could have their view, but it didn't need to affect her. So she's grown up to be a very articulate, confident young woman, and I'm absolutely proud of her. My memoir tells a story that I went through. It isn't the doctor's story, and I know there may be going to be a debate here about what's biased or balanced, but I don't believe in balance, actually, and I think that there's no objective view because everyone is subjective, and you're all carrying baggage from previous generations, from your family upbringing, from your education. So I'm going to be quite interested in the debate later on. What I would say in trying to wind up is that life is full of many, many challenges, very many triumphs, and I have had some of those in my life, which I'm happy about, and very many traumas, one of which I've just gone through the last few weeks. But memoirs can help strengthen us, because I do think that they recount the real pain and sorrow in life and what we have to suffer, but also give us a resilience and uplifting spirit about what we can actually endure and what we can get past, and how life goes through different chapters. So if anyone in here is actually having a really tough time, I wish you all the best. Hang on in there. Tomorrow's another day, and you just put one foot in front of the other. And for me, I count my blessings that I have one gorgeous daughter who's 32 and a lovely little grandson who's 18 months. And I thank Ringwood for all the support they've given me the last decade. Thank you very much.
Next we hear from Sandy Jamieson, who's the Chief Executive of Ringwood Publishing.
One of the few pluses about being a small publisher is the opportunity to meet, get to know, and in some cases befriend an exceptional group that Ringwood has of talented, committed Scottish authors writing Scottish stories. The two authors I want to talk about today, Brendan McLaughlin and John Keeman, fit strongly into that pattern. I'm proud that I was able to help get their book published, and I'm happy that I was pleased to call them friends. But one of the downsides of publishing the stories of hard lives well lived is that they appear in print near the end of those lives. And Brendan died in 2022 before we even published his book, the 1st of May. But it was a comfort to know that he knew that Ringwood would definitely be publishing it. John's book, In the Shadow of the Crane, was published in 2020, and John's last few years were sad ones, beset by illness and further family tragedies, and John finally died on the 5th of January this year, which isn't that long ago, so some of us are still in mourning about that. But his family were happy for us to proceed to involve his book. I want to tell you briefly about these two men and the similarities that led them both to publishing political memoirs, and about the differences that led to these being two very, very different kinds of political memoirs. Both of them were born into poor families in two of the most deprived areas of Glasgow around about the time the welfare state was created. Both struggled at school and left early without any qualifications. But later in life, both used the welfare state to enter free higher education, and both obtained good degrees and postgraduate qualifications. Brendan went on to become a very well-known, prominent Glaswegian and the city's best-loved pub landlord, owning the Scotia Bar, which he turned into a literary salon in one of his better puns, and the Clutha, which he turned into Glasgow's finest music salon. John made his career with BBC Radio and TV, telling people his rights, their rights, which he's been doing for a long time anyway. They were both early entrants into that group of people who know that everything, absolutely everything, is political. They both knew that only political action could create the fair, socially just and caring society that they wanted to see. Neither had faith in any existing political parties to achieve that outcome. They both wanted to share their vision of a better future, and both wrote their books partly to help convert people to the need to build a fairer, more socially just society in Scotland, run by Scots, without having others' values and ideologies that Scots never voted for imposed upon them. So that's the similarities. But a fundamental difference of approach is reflected in the political memoirs. John believed in making the world a better place by his own efforts, and he devoted his life to representing people in their individual fights against an often cruel and callous system, representing them in employment tribunals, welfare hearings, etc., and his success rate was phenomenal. But John's central political theme of his book was that the welfare state was a major boon to the Scottish working class, a compassionate and caring response that improved the health, education and well-being of Scotland's people. He saw the first 30 years of the welfare state as a wonderful model of how a Scottish state could prosper while looking after its poorest, weakest and most vulnerable people. Then along came the hated Margaret Thatcher, stating there is no such thing as society and starting the processes of dismantling the welfare state that over the past 45 years, because that's how long it's been going on for, has accelerated and turned it into the broken, ruined rump it is today, that no longer protects the weak, the poor and the vulnerable under Tory governments that Scotland never remotely voted for. John's book is a painful lament of this destruction. In the Shadow of the Crane is a personal memoir, but because John believed all personal things are political, it's also a political memoir. Brendan, on the other hand, had a different political creed and solution. He believed individual actions effectively changed nothing. All his life, he both preached and practiced the necessity for collective action at a local level, at a national level and international level. He despised all political parties equally. In the best of his many written puns, the only political party he joined was the Socialist Workers' Party. Think about that. And it is no coincidence his book is set in International Workers' Day. His book, The 1st of May, is the first serious Scottish contribution to the fastest growing literary subgenre of recent years, angry autobiography as a political weapon. John and Brendan were two of the finest men, the best men I've ever known. If you want to honour their memory or learn more about them, read their books. I commend them to you strongly.
The next speaker is Siobhan, who's the daughter of author Brendan McLaughlin.
Hi everyone. Obviously Sandy's explained why I'm here today representing my dad. We've been actually delighted that Ringwood has been able to publish this book and also to continue working with us as a family to make sure that the editing was completed and that we launched it in the style that my dad would have loved. So it's fantastic for it to be selected today to be part of this event. Obviously we spoke a little bit about the kind of person my dad was. Fundamentally he was just really interested in people and in their stories and in their struggles and injustice for people really and helping where he could. He loved Scotland, especially Glasgow, and he could talk all day if you let him about any of these subjects and often did. So when I was young, he wrote songs quite often and later short stories, but he really focused on writing a novel when he lost his parents when he was in his 40s and realised that they hadn't left a proper legacy of all that they were. Like he knew that they were creative people, they often sang at parties and things and we had very little to demonstrate to anyone what they were like as people. It was his dream, to complete his book and to have it published. And we were really delighted that he was able to actually sign the contract with Ringwood and to have the conversations that he had with you, Sandy, before he passed away, so that you and Joni and Matt and Myra could, confidently edit and finish the book for him. So it's been really fantastic for us as a family to celebrate this. And for him to have the recognition as a published author was a really big thing for a man who probably presented as very confident, but I'd say that he probably lacked real deep confidence in himself and in his abilities. So this has been a real big success for us, for him to have that recognition. Yeah, and I just thank you really for including it in today, and it'll be really interesting to see what the debate brings. Thank you.
This first reading is from page 191. My "aye, that'll be right" ethos about such buncombe was humbly based on what I learned and living my life amongst ordinary people in a common sense folklore that allowed me to have my own conclusions about love being the only empire of faith worth believing in. Why genuine love was more than simple romantic meandering between human hearts. To have the faith of love, folk needed to live it and not just talk about it. Be cognizant how they conducted their lives in respect to one another. Though it might sound pure mad and completely daft too, the relationships I had with my pubs, staff and customers might just owe some of their success to that very ethos. The regulars and playing clientele of the Scotia and the Clutha were invited to invest themselves in an earnest quest to create something different from anything they'd experienced before. The chance to whet a bit more than their appetite in the community partnership of 2 public houses that offered them so much more than what their forefathers and mothers got in the drinking dens once found in nearly every corner in every industrial city like Glasgow, to keep workers as well oiled and insensible as the tools and machines they worked with. I sat reminiscing about what I'd learned over the years from my experience in pubs, how I'd always tried to operate from the drinking and sing-song side of the bar as the best way to keep everything in balance. Much helped that I'd been a customer in Scotia myself during the late 60s and throughout most of the 70s, when it was the bohemian hub of Glasgow, round the corner from Paddy's Market, cafes dosed on the Brigade, soup the world's best chef will be proud of, knuckles of beef, neeps and tatties, and flanks of mutton and cabbage with belly buttons pinging. The oldest part of Glasgow and the River Clyde bustling with its own natural frum and theatre for the art of living in the underbelly of the city. I'd known it was better to be highly visible among the punters in the pubs, keep control of the floors and an eye on the doors for troublesome opportunities, while at the time calling the convivial shots and minding shot with an ever watchful wink in my eye. Democracy, for goodness sake, not always perfect, but were it not such moments that led to the minutes of reflection that had artists, philosophers and scientists spending endless hours, years, lifetimes, looking for the light that might let them take the path into the future in the quest to find that singular point of empirical persuasion in their search for that unattainable place where there might never be anything more certain than maybe, but also the very horizon that more and more folk aim their existence at. Even if few of the highbrows and filthy rich ever got anywhere near interested in getting to the bottom of humanity's topmost questions, whether one was morally impartial or spiritually sensitive, it was always worth it to wake up in the morning and say, thanks to all those who helped make the world a better place.
Hi, I'm Emma and I'm the support worker for In the Shadow of the Crane. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet John and discuss his work, but I hope I can do it some justice today because it truly is an awe-inspiring memoir. So the first passage is a quick anecdote from the days where he worked in a bar. There were plenty of interesting characters that came into this bar, and here's one of them. There was rarely a dull moment in the Two Ways pub. One night, the guy who ran the catalogue scam was drinking with Joe and some others. He stayed on the first floor of the tenement above the pub. When his tea was ready, his wife would call out the window. This particular night, she'd called 3 times, but he continued drinking at the bar. I heard a commotion at the door that led out into Kent Road, and looked over to see his wife wrestling with a mattress. She finally got it through the door, left it in the middle of the floor and shouted, "Why don't you just sleep in the effing pub?" I was about to come out from behind the bar to reason with her, but she walked out, followed by roars of laughter. She was no sooner gone than she opened the door again and threw an alarm clock across the bar, shouting at me, "And you can get him up for his effing work in the morning." This next reading jumps a bit to the 1980s after he has gone through higher education and is now working full-time. It was June 1986 when I completed my HND successfully, but I was nowhere near obtaining a good permanent job. One was advertised in the job centre that I thought would suit me very well. Renfrewshire Council advertised for someone with an HGV licence and a legal qualification. I figured there could not be too many people who met this criterion, and I applied, but didn't even get an interview. The council was setting up a mobile welfare benefits information service, along the lines of a mobile library. I had the driving experience, of course, and I also had some experience of the social security system, having represented a number of people at various appeals. I'd also represented workers at what is now termed an employment tribunal. The Labour government under Blair changed the title from industrial tribunal, lest anyone got the daft idea that we had an industry left in Britain. They would also change the references to social welfare by introducing the Department of Work and Pensions to replace the Department of Social Security. I had one offer of a job as a pre-recognition agent. This involved speaking with witnesses about what they claimed to have seen or heard in a criminal or civil case. It requires the ability to record accurately what you're told, regardless of how poor the person's grammar may be, or the fact that they may use local expressions for everyday terms, known by another name elsewhere. After thinking it over, I honestly did not relish the idea of going into a housing estate on a dark evening, interviewing Mad Dog McGurn about his alleged assault of 3 police officers, so I declined. I found myself being asked to help with advice on faulty goods, wills, and other general legal stuff, which kept me busy reading and writing for a while. I worked with adult basic education, which was rewarding but unpaid. I remember my first student simply wanted to learn to write, chiefly because she wanted to communicate with her brother who was in Australia. A couple of days after her first lesson, I saw her in the street along with a man I presumed was her husband. I was on the verge of saying hello when she pulled him into a shop and indicated I shouldn't say anything. At her next lesson, she explained that she hadn't told her husband she was going to ABE, and if she'd said hello, he would have asked too many questions. Who was I? How did she know me? And so on. I was quite taken aback that she seemed ashamed of being unable to read and write. A few months later, she wrote to her brother. We both laughed at his reply because the first thing he asked her was who wrote the letter for her. I remember also having a young man who simply wanted to be able to write numbers as words. He was running his own disco business and was getting a lot of work. He'd been advised to keep accounts for tax purposes and to pay any expenses by writing a cheque, but he couldn't express a sum like £17.54 in words. I asked him if he was ever asked in writing to play a particular song, and he said he did. So what did you do if you can't read it? I asked. His reply was that he just made out that the person was a bad writer. In essence, he covered up his own embarrassment by embarrassing someone else.
The next speaker is author Maureen Cullen.
Kitten Heels is a work of fiction. It has been called akin to a memoir. I'm not sure if I agree with that totally, but that's for the debate later. The book is about 13 coming 14-year-old girl, Kathleen Gallagher, who lives in a fictional town called Havoc, which I want to represent any of the towns on the Clyde, including Glasgow. She is the oldest in the family, and she ends up having to take on the caregiving role as her mother separates from the father. The father's gone off with a bit of stuff. He's still in the town as far as she knows, and still working at the yards. She has 3 siblings, younger siblings, including a baby that she has to look after. She's a clever girl, she's bright at school, but she's meeting an awful lot of obstacles in the way of her education. No less having to look after her family, having to work part-time in the shop, even at 13, and having to deal with her mother who, after her granny dies, becomes increasingly unstable. So that's the story, and the story is about how this girl manages or doesn't manage to overcome overwhelming obstacles of institutionalised power, the effects of the Catholic Church on the family, her poverty, lack of opportunity, and on, really. I wanted to give her a voice that was representative of where she lived, where I lived in Dumbarton, which is a Glasgow dialect. So I've written it in Glasgow dialect, or really my own dialect, whatever you're hearing now, that's what's in the book. That was important to me because it's part of the identity of the character, and I wanted her voice to be heard. She's a young girl, she's poor, she's isolated in some ways, she's a caregiver, and she's probably no different from many young women today, unfortunately, which is sad to say. I don't give the father in this book much time, but he does have a little bit here. It was tea time on Friday, and it felt like autumn. Wind slapped your face as you ran, and rain threatened so you could taste it in your tongue, a kind of dampness that hadn't yet solidified into droplets. Luckily my hood was up and I had a wool scarf wound around my face. I was in disguise and I had to blend into the tenements behind me. I planned to do this next Friday, but once the notion got hold I couldn't shake it. Anyway, I was only checking him out to see if he still worked in the yards. Next time, I'd see where he was living, one thing at a time. Mum thought I was at the library for a certain maths book, an emergency, as I'd only 3 weeks to study for an exam on the first day back at school. It was a lie, and though my mother wasn't a fan of education, she loved nuns, and they could do no wrong, so whatever they demanded, she'd supply. When the sirens went off, I stepped back against the wall and peeped around the corner. The street was packed with women, wains, prams, dogs and leads, waiting for men to come out with the wage packets. I hoped I wouldn't lose sight of him in the rush. Of course, he was taller than most and stood out amongst most of the ugly mugs round here. I wasn't anywhere near the old spot where we used to meet. Just in case he looked that way, I chastised myself. Why would he do that? The big gates opened with a loud screech, followed by a wave of gruff voices, whistles, stomping feet. Sounds of men freed from their labours and excited about the coming chance to let off steam in the town's pubs. Was every welder, plumber and electrician the same? Did some no just go home, for God's sake? Not every wife was like my mother, and it corresponded that not every man was like my father. For instance, what about Big Jim at the shop? A decent sort, hard worker and devoted son who didn't go off drinking his wages away. Mind, maybe he should get out a wee bit more himself. Then there was my friend Amy's dad. I'd been a bit cautious of him at first, not being used to English voices. And that talk about him being in the Knights of Columbia disturbed me. They were even holier than the St Vincent crowd, but higher on the social ladder. I hadn't been able to find out what they actually did. Good works. But who for? We hadn't seen any sign of them round our place. But Mr Roberts had been nothing but kind and helpful to me. I've met him several times now at their house, and he loved Amy to bits. No, he wasn't what was called a drinking man. The liquor in his crystal decanter just stayed at the same level. I nearly missed Dad. Catching the tail end of him as he laughed his way out the gates. He slowed, glanced in the direction of our usual spot, shrugged and strode up George Street. Maybe he did wonder. Men were being waylaid all the way up, rummaging in their pockets, deals being made on the spot with their women. But not him, he's a free agent. The cheek of him, when he had a family at home, a wife to keep, a baby son he knew nothing about. My face flushed, my chest burned, I blew out several times to calm down. All right, I'd established he was working in the yards. No point following him to the cutty sack. But my nose got the better of me. I wanted a closer glimpse of his face. I hurried through the crowd, keeping my head down. I didn't want anyone to recognise me and tell Mum. I turned after him in Main Road, keeping my eyes glued to his bouncing curls. He was indeed taller and broader than the men around him, and his swagger was easy to keep track of. Hadn't a care in the world. We were barely holding on, and he was jesting with his pals, now and then stopping to take one or the other in a headlock, like wee boys. And he should. No wonder Mum didn't want him back. My head burst with the exertion of anger. It gripped my throat, and I lost my wits. I raced forward and tugged him by the back of his jacket. "Stop!" he yelled. He turned and stopped. The other men halted with him a moment. The backdrop shamefaced and they recognised me. Moving on, when he nodded it was all right. "Kathleen, darling." He opened his arm in greeting, a wide grin in his face. I kicked him. My shoe met his thigh with a satisfying thump. Even more rewarding was the way his leg gave way and how he staggered back. But he was quick. He steadied and gripped me around the back. the trunk, swinging me forward so I couldn't kick him again. I was enraged. How dare he? Struggling, I kicked into air and squirmed, but he held fast, a breath knocking in my ears. I was vaguely aware of his hushing me, a rhythmic tone of sound. A group of men approached. "All right, Hen," one of them stopped, squaring his barreled chest. I spat out, "No, no." Dad's grip weakened. He let go, and as I bolted, the man swung at him. I heard a cry, a groan, and then, "She's my fucking daughter, Richard." I didn't stick around. I was halfway through the play pack when I stopped for breath.
The next speaker is author Kirsten McQuarrie.
Hi everyone, my name is Kirsten, and yeah, I'm something of the wild card this afternoon because Remember the Round is a novel, but it wouldn't exist without a memoir. It's inspired by the true story of what I call the unrequited love between the poet and scholar Dr. Kathleen Raine and the author naturalist Gavin Maxwell. Now, many of you will have encountered Gavin Maxwell through Ring of Bright Water, his world-famous book that later became an internationally best-selling film. But what remains little known to this day is the fact that Ring of Bright Water took its title from one of Kathleen's poems. They shared a very intense, emotional, even spiritual connection. They cared for a pet otter together. They nurtured a home at Sandaig in the wildest reaches of the West Highlands. But Gavin couldn't quite love Kathleen the way that she loved him. And as you'll discover in this extract, storm clouds were all too soon gathering over their Highland idyll. Have there been others? Gavin gives no answer, which I take as an answer in itself. You've brought friends here too, he says eventually. You've shared Sunday with other people. I brought Winifred. I throw my retort back at Gavin, angered anew at the sacrilege of hearing the name of our paradise dragged down into this dirt. She came here to paint. I didn't bring her to... Words desert me. The poet and the woman in me cede to the animal raging inside. But this is no natural creature. This infuriated, foaming-mouthed beast is deformed, cloven-hoofed and black-horned. It is brutish, savage, demonic. You disgust me. I disgust myself, even as I say it, but it achieves what I only realise in retrospect was my intention. I see it strike Gavin's face, my show of revulsion hitting him with all the bloodied, brutal viciousness of a wildcat's swiped claw. One word, once again, and we are severed from one another. His cheeks flush as if I'd slapped him. A violent low blow, hard and fast enough to leave us both reeling. In the silence that follows, I watch him summoning up his strength. Tall and upright, injured yet undeniably courageous. I admire him for it, I realise in shock. Deep, abiding affection rippling like drops of fresh water within the blood-stained bilge of my hatred. Heaven help me, a part of me still loves him. As long as I live, a part of me will love him. But I did not speak of love, did I? Only disgust. If that's true, Gavin says, it's even more reason for you to leave. I lash out, a howl of anguish borne aloft in the air at the thought of being cast out of our Eden. My limbs slash towards him and I see shot flit across Gavin's face before, with military perfected precision, those famous reflexes kick in. He seizes my wrists, a tight grip holding me away from his torso, so I flail like a ragdoll tossed to the wind. With all the physical strength I possess, even with the waterfall's weight of fury coursing through my veins, I cannot overpower him. The throb of nascent bruising is pushing through my skin. My pulse beats with the impotent fury against the pressure of his fingertips. His physical power startles me, even as I writhe and resist. I remember the first day we met, opening my door to a stranger who looked too fragile to stand without support. Gavin needed strength from me back then. I kick out, walking boots swinging wildly like those of a woman breathing her last on the gallows, inevitably missing my target, which I believe through my vague mist of rage was Gavin's shins. I sink, collapsing tattered and dishevelled into a heap at his feet. Only then does he let go, dropping me as one unwanted.
Next, we have a panel discussion and questions from the audience.
Are memoirs the best lens for understanding our past, or do fiction and historical accounts offer a more balanced perspective?
I think there's a place, obviously, for everything. I mean, I can't compare my fictional story to a memoir. I can only compare my fictional story to the story I might have written as a memoir. If I had written this as a memoir, I think I would have lost an awful lot of material, because I don't think that I could have presented Kathleen's voice appropriately and fully as a memoir. I didn't have enough of a wide lens on the story. There is personal material in Kitten Heals. There's a lot of truth about Kathleen's situation, which mirrors my own, but then it goes on into a more dramatic story than I could have written as a memoir. And also, I think her story in terms of the time of 1962-63, which I was focused on for other reasons. At that time I was 7 years old, so I needed a longer lens, really, than I could have manufactured myself from my own experience. And I also needed to look at the experience of other people in terms of trying to establish a coherent and attractive and sympathetic voice. I used experience from my working life as well, which was later on. So that would have been very difficult to incorporate in a memoir from only my own experience. It's designed really to allow the child's voice to come through the work. It's said to have had the immediacy of memoir. I take that as a great compliment, actually. It wasn't intended, but what was intended was to bring the reader as close as possible to the character. And to do that, probably many of you will have heard of John Gardner's The Art of Fiction, where he talks about the fictive dream, where a fiction writer can manufacture enough believability for the reader to feel that it's actually real and that it's not made up, that when they're in this story that they actually feel it's a real story. It's a slice of life, and it's really, and I'm not owning this, but it's the magic of fiction, really, and that's what happens.
I suppose I start from the sort of feminist perspective that the personal is political, and that when something real has happened, the power of that story, for instance, just in terms of my story, was real outrage at the way I had been treated, and that how this was wrong and things needed to change. And I think that the story told in such detail encouraged other people to agree that things were wrong and needed to change, and that actually single parent families should be supported and shouldn't be shunned. And when you look back to what particularly happened in Ireland with the Magdalene laundries and how women who got pregnant outside marriage were treated, that actually telling your recent experience of how these sort of attitudes still prevail within the medical profession, within the legal establishment, I wanted things to actually change. So I think real life experience, honestly told, does elicit immediate change. And I also think that the honesty behind the memoir, I'm reading a book called Wifedom, and it's told from the perspective of George Orwell's wife. And I'd quite like a lot of left-wing men to read this book, because it gives a very, very different perspective on George Orwell and his decisions to go off to the Spanish War and his decisions to do all these worldly things, but the ramifications that had on his wife and his family. I've also read, lots and lots of memoirs, biographies, and I think that the personal experience and the adversity that people overcome, to me, is much more powerful than reading only a fictionalised account, although I don't think it needs to be a polarised debate. I think, Waterson's across the road has shelves and shelves full of books. We should be reading all the books we can and educating ourselves. And I found that reading lots of memoirs about different cultures that I've never known. I've read The Boy with the Top Knot about the Sikh family. I've read Educated by Tara Westover, which is all about being brought up in a Mormon family in America. I've most recently read and tweeted to Polly Toynbee, who's written An Uneasy Inheritance, about being brought up middle class. And I was like, well, there you go then, that wasn't actually very good, was it? So I sent her a tweet saying I found her memoir very interesting because she was born into this family of influential people who had been Oxford dons and whatever, and the pressure was on her from day one to aspire to that level. And when she dropped out of Oxford, then they weren't very supportive to all of that. So I think recounting the actual experience of real people has a power behind it that a fictionalised account can't always, for me, because you know that it's made up by someone, however good the imagination is. It's not an honest account. Margaret Foster wrote this book about an ordinary woman, and I read it, and it was absolutely fabulous. What this was from the perspective of an older woman. She's looking back. She'd been at Greenham Common. She'd done all these things that I've done, and after I finished it, I was like, I'm going to find her grave, and I'm going to go and take flowers, and I'm going to do this and I was utterly deflated to find she wasn't real, that she had made this woman up and, you know, pieced together the different episodes and the different chapters. So for me, I like really real life stories of real people who hold the rest of us up and give the rest of us courage to keep going.
I want to talk about a couple of other people's books at the moment, because the thing that comes totally to mind to me is two women who were both called Harriet, and they lived almost exactly the same time. They were born within a year of each other, and they died within a year of each other, and they both wrote anti-slavery abolitionist books against the institution of slavery. They lived right through the 19th century in America. And one was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe was very well connected, which of course is important in getting your book promoted. And her book was actually a bestseller. It sold more than any book in its time apart from the Bible. And Abraham Lincoln said to her, of course, naturally she met Abraham Lincoln, he said to her, you know, you're the one who actually brought on this civil war. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe was friendly with the Duchess of Sutherland. She was responsible for the Highland clearances, and to, you know, help her friend, she wrote articles saying that the Highland clearances were really good, and they brought on the Highlands, and, you know, not true, people got bumped out their houses and things. So, I mean, there's two sides to her, but she was very, very anti-slavery, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which of course is fiction, but she did a lot of research. And the most exciting episode in her book is when Eliza is running away from slave catchers, carrying her 4-year-old child. She comes to the River Ohio, which is in Spate, and the slave catchers are right behind her, and she starts jumping from ice floe to across the river, gets to the other side, carrying the baby in her arms, not baby, 4-year-old child in her arms. And I remember thinking, really, you know? But it actually happened. She took that from truth. A woman called Eliza running from slave catchers actually did that. And her book, being fiction, is wide in scope, as Maureen said, you know, she had a wider scope. She saw things from the white point of view, and from the, well, she tried to see it anyway from the black or poor side and everything. She brings in things about the sexual pressure that girls were under. She mentions, again from the white point of view, the naive young girl who gets married off to an old planter, and she turns up at a new home and gradually becomes aware that there are quite a few mixed race kids running about, and she slowly either goes into denial or puts two and two together or whatever. She also mentions that when women were up for auction with their daughters, they would plead with the person buying them to buy the daughter as well. Or they would sometimes try and make their daughter look messy, muss up trying to make her look unattractive, while meanwhile the slave trader was trying to make her look absolutely beautiful. So she does mention that kind of thing, and since it's fiction, it's full of conversation, it's very dramatic, and okay, Uncle Tom is so saintly, is unbelievable, but we are talking 19th century, and they were more sentimental and romantic in those days. Meanwhile, Harriet Ann Jacobs wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl Told by Herself. She tells it not as exciting and dramatic as Uncle Tom's Cabin. There are some conversations, but it's not kind of told through conversation. It's told through her point of view, but we get so much insight into the actual personal, the misery of living with constant injustice, no rights at all. The sexual harassment bit, which actually caused her problems in trying to get the book published. Her owner was sexually harassing her all the time, but of course not only was he at her all the time and she had no defence against this, but his wife, of course, was full of hatred and jealousy of her because of this. And she was living in a house with one man predating on her, the wife hating her, and both these people had absolute power over her in every single way. And the most dramatic bit in her book, she does mention when she first became aware she was a slave, and that's something that you don't see in most accounts. She was 6 years old when she realised her slave status. Her mother died, and suddenly she was up for sale, and that's the first time she realised she was a slave. The most dramatic bit in her life is when she lived for 7 years in the cramped roof space of her grandmother's cabin, because she didn't want to run away to the north. She had 2 children she wanted to keep an eye on, not that she could protect them very much. So she stayed in the town, but she stayed in this roof space with a wee tiny hole in the wall and looked out on them to see, if they were still about and so on. She did that for 7 years, only coming out at night to walk about a wee bit and stretch her legs. So really, Harriet Beecher Stowe is it's an exciting book, and it's been made into many films. It's now considered too controversial to be made into a film, but from both the black side and the white side. It's basically gone out of date. But they made a lot of films in the 20s, they went silent movies about it, and also in the 30s, so it's made loads of films. Harriet Ann Jacobs had difficulty in getting a book published, partly because she was in hiding in the north. And she had a future where after the Civil War, she set up hospitals and educational establishments for black children, and she travelled. She was over in Scotland at one point. Hers is a more unusual book, definitely, although Harriet Beecher Stowe has a wider perspective. Obviously, she brings in the politicians, she's well connected, she's in first name terms with all these movers and shakers. Okay, the fiction, if it's well researched and so on, but for the psychological experience, you can't really beat memoirs.
It was so interesting, Carol, that mention of Sonia Orwell, who was a good friend of Kathleen Raine. So I wonder if I could bring in the voice of just a sick, wonderful woman. I said at the beginning that Remember the Rain is a novel that wouldn't exist without a memoir. And Kathleen Raine's third volume of autobiography, The Lion's Mouth, was absolutely the North Star of my research, of me knowing what she wanted out there, her own perspective and her own voice. And at the beginning of this is the collected edition of 3 of her 4 autobiographical volumes, she asks herself this very question as well. A journalist friend recently asked me why I had not written my story as a novel. It would have had better sales. Sandy, you can confirm that or otherwise for us later. It was the fashion a generation ago for women novelists to fictionalise their lives, and readers would speculate about which character was so-and-so. But no poet could ever have done this. For the poet, truth alone counts. And how easy in a novel to falsify here and there, to depart from reality, to tell a different story. Well, might not that different story have been closer to our inner truth, what we meant, tried to, or would have liked to live? But if the story is our own confession, then the only measure is the depth of understanding we have been able to attain. It is never enough. And I think never a truer word spoken, because actually, the fact that Kathleen's voice is already out there, I mean, all her autobiographies are long since out of print, but the question for me was, what can I bring to this? Why me? But when I read her, firstly, that was what moved me to research her, to understand her more. She blames herself mercilessly for everything that went wrong in her relationship with Gavin Maxwell. And again, Maureen, you mentioned lenses and having different lenses, different perspectives. And the feminist one was something that I felt I could bring to her story, and touched on in other events the fact that Kathleen famously called herself no feminist. And yet that did mean that she was so self-punishing, so self-criminating for everything that had gone wrong. But me coming at it from many decades later, could see actually, perspectives, social conditions that actually her vision was such that ironically it blinded her to them. So it was out of compassion, out of empathy, and wishing to walk in her footsteps. So I would say that, yes, I think all of us can only write one perspective, but that's a thing to embrace, as you mentioned, with Waterston's. And here in the library, the shelves are absolutely filled with wonderful stories. I think Virginia Woolf, she said that if anonymous was often a woman, then neutral is too often a man. And in fact, bringing women across the generations, as we're doing today and as Ringwood have been doing for decades now, I think that memoir and novel, very often they don't need to be in competition, they can be in conversation.
Having the process of writing, did it reveal any biases that you perhaps didn't previously know you had?
Well, I think the process of writing is a challenge in itself, and when I presented my first draft to a group, the feedback I got was, this is a very interesting story, but my God, are you angry? You are hitting your reader over the head every chapter. There was this doctor, and then there was this other one, and well, he was worse, and so it went on. So I think you become aware of how to tell a story as best you can, so that it's received and understood. I went through a lot of processes and redrafting and writing, and trying to tell the story from my perspective in terms of who I was and what my life was about, and not just one story in isolation. But I have to say, I really don't mind being biased at all. I mean, I was very clear in the front, it says Memoirs of a Feminist Mother, and that's my story, and that's where I'm coming from, and that's the story I wanted to tell. And other people can tell stories from a completely different perspective. That's where you'll get your balance, because you'll have some stories from one perspective and you'll have other stories from another perspective.
I thought there was a lot of similarities between Wifedom and Remember the Rowan, and so for me it was really helpful reading these two books about horrible upper middle class men who were entitled. But also both your book and Wifedom is based on memoir, but is written by somebody who's had time to filter it and filter through the anger, etc. So I'm thinking when Carol's talking, I wonder if in 50 years' time somebody will take your memoirs and sort of filter them. Have you read Wifedom?
Yes, actually, and especially because of the relationship between Kathleen Raine and George Orwell's wife. And it's such an interesting point because I like that approach to reading. It's not one story, it's every story is a chapter of our wider understanding. Because I don't know about everybody else, but whether we're writing fact, fiction, a blend of the two, the tip that we often get and share is show, don't tell. Really what seems to be resonating is how embodied the experience is in both memoir and fictionalised herstory, perhaps we could call it. I would describe Gavin Maxwell as he's the anti-hero of the story, but you know what, it's documented in Kathleen's work and indeed in his own, the way he behaved, quite often the language he used towards her. So if he becomes a villain in some people's eyes, there's not much we can do about it if we know that the thread has been true. But yeah, my goodness, it would be fascinating to think, Carol, how does your own daughter, how does she approach your work?
You never know, there might be a sequel. So I think I would leave that up to her, because she's now establishing her own family and living in London and being very successful. Yeah. And I'm immensely proud of her. And what I think is, on a wet Wednesday afternoon when I was thrown out of a hospital in Monklands, had I just got on the bus and gone home and done nothing about it, she wouldn't be here. My grandson wouldn't be here. So it's really about, for me, exercising agency over your own life and then telling that story so that it gives other people the chance to make their own choices. They may be completely different choices, but it's for young women particularly. And I brought my daughter up to know that she was wanted and loved and the world was her oyster. And I hope that I'm being a supportive mother to her to do whatever she chooses to do. So for the younger generations, I don't want us to be in any way in conflict. I want us to understand that we all kind of are held up by the struggles that have gone before.
When I was writing Two Clauses in a Referendum, I was very much, before I was writing it, I was very much involved in the Yes side in activism, and I was doing that several days a week. My whole 2014 was taken up on the yes side. But when I came to write Two Closes in the Referendum, I also wanted to present the no side. So I read Joe Pike's book, Project Fear. Joe Pike wrote from the no side, so I read that book very carefully, and I even gave it an acknowledgement, and also went to the Better Together office and got a whole lot of the literature and studied it and so on, because I didn't want to only present one side. I thought it's a referendum, you want to present both, and you don't want to present the Better Together as just horrible snobby folk. I wanted to present them as nice people, and that makes the book more believable in my view, although the personal memoirs are all on the yes side.
So there's something that Carol talked about, which is how her memoir kind of is quite educational for women. They kind of get to learn about what happened in society at that time, and I think that kind of resonates with all of your works. I think, do you think what makes memoirs so unique compared to different genres?
Well, I would just say briefly, I think any woman recording her story in any mode or method that she sees fit can only be a good thing, because as we've touched on, historically and around the world today, women's stories are being silenced. Somebody who's been a great mentor to me, and you see her on the cover of Remember the Round, Sarah Sheridan, she's often made the point to me, because she also writes historical fiction, that we're stuck in class 101. We're stuck learning where's the analysis, where's the reflection, because we're still having to build the bricks when a story is lost, when a women's experiences are lost to the annals of history. We have to relearn, we have to continually cover the same ground, and that means that we can't grow, that we can't flourish, that we can't pass the baton to the next generation of women. So that is why it's so valuable to have stories preserved in this way. Yes, I wouldn't get too caught up with which genre or which mode you choose. I think the most important thing is having that voice preserved, and there's space in the bookshop and there's space in the library shelves for it.
Just want to go back to one point about not having truth in fiction. I think there is a lot of truth in fiction, and I think the reader, and it certainly me as a reader, can recognise that if it's not consistent, it's not heartfelt, if I'm not with the character fully, then I know that there's something dishonest going on. But in well-presented fiction, I think there is certainly truth.
We'll put in the notes who the authors were and what their books are called, and Ringwood Publishers, if you want to read them. And I think I'll be certainly putting a couple on my Christmas list, if not before.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, at the beginning you said this isn't exactly the kind of event that we might go on a podcast on specifically to do with independence. But it left me thinking the actual event, no, it's not all to do with independence, not at all, but it's to do with Scots. Yes. And it's to do with our society, and it's to do with what we'd like from it, and then what happens, but sometimes the things that happen are what we don't want. And it just gets me back to that view that culture and society and what happens to ordinary people and their aspirations, that has to underlie and strengthen any independence campaign. So I'm really kind of wanted to say, thanks again to Ringwood for putting that on.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.